purpose of this video is to compare atoms, elements, and compounds. These are terms that a lot of people end up using interchangeably, and that simply isn't correct. So for starters, we're going to begin with the smallest one and then build. So atoms are the smallest and most simplistic. Then we'll build to talking about elements, and then finally to discussing compounds. But first, if we just look at a model of an atom here, hopefully you've seen something similar to this before. Atoms have three different parts. They have electrons, which are negative. These are around the outside of the atom. This is called the electron cloud. In this particular example, we're looking at a carbon atom. A carbon atom happens to have 6 electrons. So it has 2 in its inner orbital and then 4 in its outermost electron orbital. The next thing we're looking at are protons. Protons are positive. Now, the thing that makes this a little misleading is there are 6 there. I realize you can only see 4, but if you look over here at the top, it says there are 6 protons. That's because carbon is a neutral molecule. So you need to have the same number of positive protons and negative electrons. The thing that's interesting are the neutrons. Neutrons are neutral. They're also found in the nucleus of the atom, in this central portion. So just to throw a couple of different labels on here for you, this stuff around the outside, this is referred to as the electron cloud. And then in the center here, that's the nucleus. We'll use nucleus again as a term actually for the center of a cell once we get to cells later on. Atoms are pretty simplistic for the most part. They're the basic building blocks of matter. As long as you know the 6 things that compose atoms, then you should be fine. The main thing to know about these is that they compose everything around you. So absolutely everything is made of atoms. All of the matter around you, anything physical, is composed of atomic molecules. The only thing surrounding you right now that's not made of atoms is light. Light, we could get into all kinds of debates whether it's a particle or a wave, but either way, it is not an atom. But pretty much everything else around you will be composed of atoms. The next one for us to talk about are elements. The simple definition for an element is that it's a pure substance that cannot be broken down into other substances by physical or chemical means. Basically, it's something that can no longer be reduced into a more simplistic version. Hopefully, you are somewhat familiar with the periodic table. I don't make you do any memorizing of the periodic table of elements. You'll do plenty of work with this in chemistry with either Mrs. Cromie or Mr. Snelling. But to talk about elements just a little bit, these are things that have certain traits in common that are composed of the same type of atoms. Now, we have 92 naturally occurring elements, and then there's up to 100. Some of them down near the bottom are things that are not naturally occurring. So some of our rarer ones down here near the end, but most of the ones up near the top are things that are naturally occurring. They're not like made in a lab or something like that and only exist for a short period of time because they're very unstable. So those last 8, going from the ones at the end there, those are the ones that are less stable. They're also the ones that end up with interesting names. We've got Einsteinium down here, Californium. Those are things that only exist in the lab and are extremely volatile. They're not going to remain as that element for very long. The thing that determines elements that's important to know is the number of protons something has. So for example, if we are looking at calcium over here, the reason calcium has that number 20 above it is because it has 20 protons in its nucleus. The number of protons is what determines what element it is, whereas something like electrons can be given up and can eventually leave an atom. Or be traded. We'll talk more about that when we talk about different types of bonding. But the number of protons is always going to remain the same in an element. The thing to remember about this is you can't break an element down any further. So you cannot take hydrogen and somehow break it down and reduce it into something smaller. An element is the most simplistic form of that substance. So compounds are where things begin to get a little bit more complicated. The definition for a compound is just a pure substance formed when 2 or more different elements combined. So to give you some example of some compounds, we now have 2 or more different elements here. For example, water is a compound. Water is composed of oxygen and 2 hydrogens. Ammonia is also a compound, so we've got 1 nitrogen and 3 hydrogens. Carbon dioxide, CO2, 1 carbon, 2 oxygens. And then methane, 1 carbon with 4 hydrogens rather. 2 things to give you a little preview here. For starters, these bonds, these bars that hold the different elements together, these are covalent bonds. That actually represents the sharing of an electron. This is something we'll talk about as we move a little bit further through the chapter. Something else to point out, you see over here there are 2 bonds. That's referred to as a double bond. Now we're sharing 2 electrons between carbon and oxygen. It's not a mistake that these elements are then closer together than these elements. A double bond is stronger than a single bond, and a triple bond is actually even stronger than a double bond. Now we don't have an example of one of those here, technically. There is sort of one over in the bottom right-hand corner right now with nitrogen. Nitrogen is triple bonded together, which makes it a very stable molecule, which is why over 70% of the atmosphere, the air that you breathe, is actually nitrogen. But one thing I want to add in here, sort of as a bonus, I'll move this down out of the way. I know it's supposed to be atoms versus elements versus compounds, but you're getting a bonus here. Compounds versus molecules. Now, this is a term that a lot of people use interchangeably. Technically, it doesn't work. It's sort of like the whole squares and rectangles thing in math. They're related, but they're not exactly interchangeable. The way this works is that all compounds are molecules, but not all molecules are compounds. So if you think about our definition, we said a compound is a pure substance formed when 2 or more different elements combined. So that means something like nitrogen. Nitrogen is a molecule because it's more than 1 element bonded together, but they're not different elements. Nitrogen, if we're looking at the formula, is just written as N2. So it's 2 nitrogen molecules bonded together, and they have that triple bond in between them, which makes them really stable. But that would be a molecule, but it's technically not a compound because they're both the same element. Something like water, though, H2O, that would be a good example of a compound because now we have 2 different elements that are involved there. So we're just throwing these terms around to make sure that you can use them appropriately when we're talking about things in class. Overall, they're really not that difficult. They just keep building in complexity. So you think atoms are the simplest thing. Everything around you is made of atoms. They're composed of 3 things. You've got the positive proton, the neutral neutron, and then the negative electron around the outside. Elements are a group of the same type of atom together. They can't be broken down into anything more simplistic. Remember that the element is determined by the number of protons that it has. And then we get to compounds and molecules. Compounds are just a pure substance formed when 2 or more different elements combined. And then a molecule is going to be 2 of the same elements, or 2 or more, I should say, of the same elements combining together. So anyway, hopefully this acts as a decent introduction for our chemistry section. We will talk more about the bonds and things that I was talking about in here later on, the covalent bonds, double and triple bonds. We'll get into that in a separate video. So make sure you answer the questions at the end of this one, and I'll see you in class tomorrow.